welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be diving into a realm where numbers meet philosophy.
That sounds intriguing.
It is. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Okay.
We're talking about the fascinating world of economics. But don't worry, you won't need a calculator for this deep dive. Instead, we're going to explore the ideas behind economics, the assumptions, values, and methods that shape how economists view the world. You can think of yourself as a philosopher sitting down with an economist, ready to ask those probing questions about the very nature of economic thought.
Yeah, it's really a journey into the why behind the what of economic activity. We're going beyond, just the stock tips and market trends to really understand the deeper philosophical currents that drive economic theories and policies.
Exactly. So let's start with the most fundamental question. What is economics, really? I mean, we all have some idea about what it involves, but how do economists themselves define their field of study?
Right, you might think of it as simply the study of money, markets, and trade, right?
Yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
And while those are certainly key elements, economics goes much deeper. It explores the choices people make when things are scarce, how those choices influence how resources are allocated, and how those decisions have ripple effects on society as a whole.
Okay, so it's about more than just crunching numbers. It's about understanding the human behavior that underlies those numbers.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to grasp this is to look at how economists have defined their field historically. For example, let's consider John Stuart Mill, a prominent figure in both economics and philosophy.
Oh yes, Mill. He's considered one of the fathers of classical economics, isn't he?
That's right. And his definition of political economy, as it was called back then, really sheds light on this very point. Mill saw it as the study of mankind, quote, in the ordinary business of life, unquote. It examines, quote, that part of individual and social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and with the use of the material requisites of well-being, unquote. He particularly focused on the pursuit of wealth as a driving force, but importantly, he also recognized that there are other motives that counteract this desire.
That's interesting. So it's not just about assuming everyone is greedy or solely motivated by financial gain.
Not at all. Mill understood that human behavior is complex, driven by a mix of motivations, some selfish, some altruistic, and everything in between. Economics for him was about understanding this interplay between various motivations and how they shape economic outcomes.
This definition already has me thinking. It seems economics acknowledges that we're not just robots programmed to maximize profit. Do you think this idea of counteracting motives is still relevant today, especially when we see issues like, income inequality and ethical consumption becoming increasingly important?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely more relevant than ever. As we grapple with complex challenges like climate change, social justice, and the role of technology in our lives, understanding the full spectrum of human motivations is crucial. We can't just assume people will always act in their own narrow self-interest.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's delve into how economists try to make sense of all this complex human behavior. I often hear about the idea of rational choice being central to economic thinking. What exactly does that mean?
It's a great question. It's one of the foundational assumptions of many economic models. Rational choice theory essentially suggests that people make decisions in a way that aims to maximize their own benefit or utility.
So it's assuming that we're all constantly calculating the best course of action to get what we want.
In a way, yes, but it's important to remember that rationality in this context doesn't necessarily imply perfect knowledge or flawless logic. It's more about a specific structure to how people make choices, regardless of whether those choices are objectively good or bad.
Okay, that helps. I'm starting to see how this plays into the way economists build their models. But you mentioned structure. Can you unpack that a bit more? It sounds a little abstract.
Sure. So we're talking about concepts like complete and transitive preferences. Imagine you're at a coffee shop trying to decide between a latte, a cappuccino, and an espresso. Having complete preferences means you can rank those drinks according to your liking. Maybe you prefer lattes the most, then cappuccinos and espressos the least.
So complete preferences basically mean you have a clear ranking in your head.
Exactly. And transitive preferences build on that. If you prefer lattes to cappuccinos and cappuccinos to espressos, then by transitivity, you also prefer lattes to espressos. Your preferences have a logical consistency to them.
I see. So rational choice theory assumes this kind of internal logic to our choices, even if we aren't always consciously aware of it.
Precisely. And this leads to a fascinating idea, the theory of revealed preference.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I've heard about this. What's revealed preference all about?
It suggests that we can figure out what someone truly prefers simply by observing their choices.
Wait, really? So just by watching my coffee order, you could deduce my entire preference structure?
Theoretically, yes. The idea is that your choices, even seemingly small ones like your coffee order, reveal something about your underlying preferences. Of course, this theory has sparked quite a bit of debate among economists and philosophers.
I bet. Because what if I ordered the espresso just because my friend insisted? Does that really reveal my true preference? Or is it more about social pressure?
That's a great point. Critics of revealed preference argue that it doesn't always account for external factors that might influence our choices. Things like social norms, limited information, or even just plain old impulse decisions.
So while it's a powerful idea, it seems like revealed preference might need some refining to truly capture the complexities of human decision-making.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's why it's so important to examine these fundamental assumptions critically.
Okay, so we've got economists trying to make sense of human behavior with concepts like rational choice and revealed preference. But here's a question that's been bugging me. Is economics truly a science? I mean, it deals with people, not atoms or molecules. Human behavior is messy and unpredictable.
That's a question that has puzzled philosophers and economists for centuries, and it leads us to a whole field called economic methodology, which grapples with the fundamental challenges of studying a subject as complex and dynamic as the economy.
So it's like if they're trying to figure out the rules of the game for doing economics in a way that's rigorous and insightful.
Exactly, and one of the key issues they grapple with is the problem of inexactness.
Inexactness. What does that mean in the context of economics?
Well, you see, economics relies heavily on simplifications and models to make sense of the world. These models often use what's called ceteris paribus clauses, meaning all other things being equal, to isolate specific economic effects.
Right, I've heard that term before. It's like trying to create a controlled experiment where you hold everything else constant to see how one variable affects another.
Exactly. But the problem is, in the real world, all other things are never truly equal. Human behavior is influenced by a multitude of factors. Emotions, social norms, random events, things that are hard to capture in a neat and tidy model.
I see the problem. So how can economics claim to be a science if it's based on assumptions that don't perfectly reflect reality?
That's the crux of the inexactness problem. It's a challenge that economists have tried to address in various ways. Some, like John Stuart Mill, advocated for a method called a priori reasoning.
Mill again. We're really getting a sense of his influence on economic thought. What's this a priori reasoning all about?
It involves starting with some basic, self-evident assumptions about human behavior, like the pursuit of wealth that we talked about earlier, and then logically deducing conclusions from those assumptions. It's like building a theoretical framework first, and then seeing how well it matches up with observations of the real world.
So it's a bit like starting with a hypothesis and then testing it against data.
Yes, in a way. But the challenge is, those initial assumptions might not always capture the nuances of reality, and that's where the debate about the role of models in economics gets really interesting.
Models, you mean those graphs and equations that economists are always using?
Exactly. Models are simplified representations of the economy. They can be incredibly useful tools for understanding complex systems, but they also come with their own set of philosophical puzzles.
Well, then let's unpack those puzzles, because I have to admit, I've always been a bit skeptical of how much we can truly learn from models that, by definition, simplify reality.
That's a healthy skepticism to have, and it's one that many philosophers of economics share.
So what are some of the key questions that come up when we start thinking about economic models?
Well, one of the most fundamental is, are these models actually telling us anything true about the world? Or are they just fictional constructs that might be useful but ultimately bear little resemblance to reality?
Right. Because if they're just fictional economies, as you called them earlier, how much can we really rely on their insights to guide real-world decisions?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that has led to some fascinating debates about the ontology of economic models.
Ontology. Now, there's a philosophical term. What does that even mean in this context?
It essentially boils down to the question of what exists. In the case of economic models, we're asking, do these theoretical constructs have a kind of reality of their own? Or are they simply tools that we use to organize our thinking about the world?
It's almost like we're asking whether those supply and demand curves we see in textbooks have a life of their own, independent of the real-world markets they're trying to represent.
Exactly. And there are different schools of thought on this. Some argue that models, even if simplified, do capture something real about the underlying structures of the economy. Others see them as more instrumental tools, useful for making predictions or testing hypotheses, but not necessarily reflecting a deeper truth about the world.
It's fascinating to see how these philosophical questions about the nature of reality and knowledge play out in the realm of economics.
Mm.
It seems like we're constantly walking this tightrope between simplification and complexity, trying to find the right balance between models that are useful and models that are true.
You've perfectly captured the dilemma.
Yeah.
And it's this tension that makes the philosophy of economics such a rich and intellectually stimulating field. It's a constant balancing act, for sure. And speaking of balance, I think it's time we addressed the ethical elephant in the room. We've been talking about models and assumptions and the pursuit of wealth, but where does morality fit into all of this? Economics is about human choices, and those choices inevitably have ethical implications.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It seems like there's a potential clash between the cold, calculating logic of economic models and the messy, value-laden world of human ethics. How do we reconcile the two?
It's a question that has sparked endless debate. One way to approach it is through the lens of welfare economics. This branch of economics focuses on how to make people better off, in some sense. It tries to assess the overall well-being generated by different economic outcomes.
Okay, so it's about maximizing happiness or well-being. But that raises another question. How do we even measure something as subjective as better off? What makes one economic outcome better than another?
That's where things get tricky. Economists have developed various metrics to assess welfare, but they all come with their own limitations. One concept you might have heard of is Pareto efficiency.
Pareto efficiency. Vaguely rings a bell. Remind me what that is again.
Sure. It essentially states that an economic outcome is efficient if it's impossible to make someone better off without making someone else worse off. Imagine you're dividing a cake. A Pareto-efficient allocation would be one where everyone gets a slice, and you can't give someone a bigger slice without taking some away from someone else.
Okay, that makes sense on a simple level, but I can already see some potential problems. What if some people are starting with much smaller slices than others? Pareto efficiency doesn't seem to care about fairness or equity in the initial distribution.
You've hit on a key limitation. Pareto efficiency focuses solely on whether it's possible to make someone better off without harming anyone else. It doesn't address the underlying distribution of resources or whether that distribution is just or equitable to begin with.
Right. It's like saying a system where a few people have enormous slices of cake and everyone else has crumbs is efficient, simply because you can't give anyone more crumbs without taking away a sliver from the already well-fed.
Yeah, it highlights a key tension in economic thought, the potential conflict between efficiency and equity. Some economists argue that focusing on efficiency ultimately leads to greater overall wealth, which can then be redistributed to address issues of inequality. Others, however, believe that a sole focus on efficiency can exacerbate existing inequalities, and that ethical considerations need to be explicitly incorporated into economic models and policies.
So it's not enough to just talk about making people better off in some abstract sense.
Yeah.
We need to consider how those benefits are distributed and whether the system itself is structured in a way that promotes fairness and justice.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another fascinating area where economics intersects with ethics, the realm of paternalism and nudges.
Oh yeah, nudges. I've heard that term thrown around a lot lately. It seems to be all the rage in behavioral economics. What exactly are nudges and how do they relate to this idea of paternalism?
Well, paternalism in its simplest form refers to policies or actions that restrict someone's freedom or autonomy in order to promote their own good. Think of it like a parent setting rules for their child, even if the child doesn't always appreciate them.
Right, like making them eat their vegetables or go to bed early.
Yeah.
But how does that play out in the world of economics? Are we talking about governments acting like parents trying to nudge citizens towards making better choices?
That's the general idea. Nudge theory, developed by economists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, suggests that it's possible to influence people's choices without resorting to outright bans or mandates. It's about subtly shaping the environment in a way that encourages people to make choices that are generally considered beneficial.
So it's like a gentle push in the right direction rather than a forceful shove. Can you give some concrete examples of how this works in practice?
Absolutely. One classic example is default options in retirement savings plans. If people have to actively opt out of saving for retirement, they're much more likely to enroll than if they have to opt in. The default setting creates a nudge towards saving.
That's interesting. It seems to be playing on our tendency towards inertia. We often just go with the default option, even if it's not necessarily the best choice for us in the long run.
Exactly. Other examples include placing healthy foods at eye level in cafeterias or using graphic warnings on cigarette packs to discourage smoking. These are all ways of nudging people towards making choices that are deemed good for their health or well-being.
I have to admit, some of this feels a little bit manipulative. I mean, is it really ethical to be subtly influencing people's choices in this way, even if it's for their own good?
That's one of the key ethical dilemmas that nudge theory raises. Critics argue that it can be a slippery slope towards paternalism, where governments or institutions overstep their boundaries and start making choices for people instead of simply empowering them to make informed decisions.
Right. It comes back to that question we were discussing earlier. Who gets to decide what constitutes a good choice? And how do we ensure that nudges are used responsibly and transparently, rather than as a tool for social engineering or control?
Those are precisely the questions we need to grapple with. There's a delicate balance to be struck between promoting individual autonomy and recognizing that people aren't always perfectly rational or well-informed. Nudge theory offers a potentially powerful tool for improving well-being, but it needs to be wielded with caution and ethical awareness.
Okay, so we've talked about nudges, paternalism, and the ethical implications of trying to influence people's choices. But I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of rationality. Economists often model human behavior as if we're perfectly rational actors, always making decisions that maximize our self-interest. But is that really an accurate reflection of how people behave in the real world?
It's a question that has led to a whole new field of economics called behavioral economics. This branch of economics draws on insights from psychology and cognitive science to challenge the traditional assumptions of rationality.
So they're basically saying, hold on, economists, real people don't always behave like the perfectly rational beings in your textbooks.
Exactly. Behavioral economists have conducted numerous experiments and studies that show how people's choices often deviate from what traditional economic models would predict. We're influenced by emotions, biases, heuristics, and all sorts of irrational impulses.
So it's like those optical illusions where your brain tricks you into seeing something that isn't really there. We think we're being rational, but our cognitive biases lead us astray.
That's a great analogy. One classic example is the framing effect. The way a choice is presented or framed can significantly influence our decisions, even if the underlying options are objectively the same.
Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
Imagine you're told there's a new disease outbreak, and there are two possible programs to combat it. Program A is guaranteed to save 200 people. Program B has a one-third probability of saving 600 people and a two-thirds probability of saving no one. Which program would you choose?
Well, Program A seems like the safer bet. It guarantees that at least some people will be saved.
That's how most people respond. Now consider the same scenario but framed differently. Program C will result in 400 people dying. Program D has a one-third probability that no one will die and a two-thirds probability that 600 people will die. Which one would you choose now?
Okay, now Program D seems more appealing, even though it's objectively the same as Program B. It's just framed in terms of losses rather than gains.
Exactly. The framing effect shows how our choices are often influenced by seemingly irrelevant factors, like the way information is presented. This challenges the traditional economic assumption that people always make choices based on a cold, rational calculation of costs and benefits.
So if humans aren't perfectly rational, what does that mean for economics as a field? Does it invalidate all those models and theories that assume rationality?
That's a question that has sparked a lot of debate. Some economists argue that while behavioral insights are important, the basic principles of economics still hold. They suggest that we can simply tweak our models to account for these biases, while others believe that a more radical shift in economic thinking is needed.
So it's about finding ways to integrate these behavioral insights into the existing framework of economics, or perhaps even rethinking some of the fundamental assumptions upon which the field is built.
Precisely. And this debate has significant implications for how we design economic policies and institutions. If we acknowledge that people are prone to making irrational decisions, then perhaps we need to create systems that nudge them towards better choices, or at least protect them from their own cognitive biases.
But again, we're back to that thorny issue of paternalism. Where do we draw the line between protecting people from themselves and respecting their freedom of choice, even if those choices aren't always in their best interest?
It's a delicate balancing act, and it highlights the importance of understanding the psychological underpinnings of economic decision-making. Behavioral economics offers a powerful lens through which to view these issues, but it also raises profound ethical questions about the role of government, the nature of choice, and the limits of rationality.
Okay, so we've delved into the world of behavioral economics and seen how it challenges the traditional assumptions of rationality. But I want to zoom out a bit and consider the broader implications of all this.
Mhm.
We've talked about models, assumptions, human behavior. It's clear that economics isn't just about dry numbers and graphs. It's a field deeply intertwined with questions about human nature values and even the nature of knowledge itself.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to a fundamental question that has puzzled philosophers of economics for centuries. What kind of truth are we dealing with in economics? Is it the same kind of truth that we find in the natural sciences based on empirical observation and objective laws? Or is it something different, something more contingent, more interpretive, perhaps even more subjective?
That's a big question to ponder. It seems like we're being asked to reflect on the very foundations of economic knowledge and how it relates to our understanding of the world.
Exactly. In physics or biology, we often aim for models that accurately represent the physical world. We test those models through experiments and observations, and if they consistently make accurate predictions, we gain confidence in their ability to capture some fundamental truth about the universe.
Right, so the truth of those scientific models is judged by their correspondence to reality. But in economics, we're dealing with human behavior, which is inherently complex, unpredictable, and influenced by all sorts of factors that are difficult to quantify or control.
Precisely. And that raises the question of whether economic models can ever truly achieve the same kind of objectivity or universality that we might expect from models in the natural sciences.
So does that mean economic truth is more fluid, more context-dependent, perhaps even more influenced by the values and assumptions of the economists themselves?
It's certainly a possibility worth considering, and this leads to a distinction between what philosophers of science call instrumental and realistic views of scientific models.
Okay, now we're getting into some serious philosophy of science territory. What's the difference between these two views?
The instrumental view, which we touched upon earlier, suggests that the primary value of a model lies in its predictive power. If a model can accurately predict economic outcomes, then its assumptions, even if unrealistic, are deemed justifiable. It's a pragmatic approach that prioritizes the usefulness of a model over its correspondence to reality.
So it's like saying, if it works, don't worry too much about whether it's true, but what about the realist view? How does that differ?
The realist view emphasizes the importance of models being grounded in real-world mechanisms and processes. Realists argue that for a model to be truly insightful, it needs to capture something true about the underlying structure of the economic system, not just generate accurate predictions.
So for realists, it's not enough for a model to just work. It also needs to reflect some fundamental truth about how the economy actually functions.
Exactly. And this debate has implications for the types of models we use and the conclusions we draw from them. Instrumentalists might be more comfortable with highly abstract models that prioritize predictive accuracy, while realists might favor models that are more closely tied to observable economic phenomena and attempt to capture the causal mechanisms at play.
It's fascinating to see how these philosophical debates about the nature of truth and the role of models play out in the field of economics. It seems like we're constantly walking this tightrope between simplification and complexity, trying to find the right balance between models that are useful and models that are true.
It's a constant balancing act, and that's why it's so important to have a philosophical perspective when thinking about economics. It helps us critically examine the assumptions, methods, and values that underpin economic theories and models.
It's like we're bringing a philosophical toolkit to the world of economics, helping us to dissect its inner workings and understand its limitations.
Exactly. And speaking of limitations, I think it's time we addressed another elephant in the room: the question of social ontology.
Okay, now we're really getting philosophical. Social ontology. What is that, and what does it have to do with economics?
Social ontology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of social reality. It asks, what kinds of things exist in the social world? What are individuals, groups, institutions, norms, values, and how do they relate to each other?
So it's like trying to figure out the building blocks of society and how they fit together to create the complex social structures we observe.
Precisely. And this has profound implications for how we do economics. For example, if we adopt a methodological individualist perspective, we might see the social world as ultimately reducible to the actions and interactions of individuals.
So everything in society, from markets to governments to cultural norms, can be explained in terms of individual choices and motivations.
That's the basic idea behind methodological individualism. On the other hand, if we adopt a more holistic or structuralist perspective, we might see social entities as having properties and causal powers that are not reducible to individuals.
So things like social norms or institutions might have a reality and influence of their own, independent of the individuals who comprise them.
Exactly. And this leads to different approaches to economic modeling. Methodological individualists might favor models that start with individual agents and build up from there, while holists might be more comfortable with models that posit social structures or institutions as fundamental entities.
It's fascinating to see how these philosophical debates about the nature of social reality play out in the way economists construct their models and theories. It seems like our understanding of economics is deeply intertwined with our understanding of society itself.
Absolutely. And it's this interconnectedness that makes the philosophy of economics such a rich and intellectually stimulating field.
All right, we're back. Ready to wrap up our deep dive into the philosophy of economics. It's been quite a journey so far. We've covered so much ground, from rational choice to nudges to even like the very nature of truth in economics.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour of some really big ideas. But I think we're starting to see how all these pieces fit together, like how philosophy helps us understand the deeper questions behind economics.
Exactly. And speaking of different perspectives, I'm wondering how different philosophical views can shape how we understand economic stuff. We've talked about, methodological individualism versus holism, but what are some other philosophical lenses we can use to view economics?
Well, one really important perspective comes from moral philosophy. Ethics, right? Ethical considerations are like woven into the very fabric of economics, even if we don't always talk about them directly.
Right, because economics is ultimately about human choices and what happens because of those choices. And those choices always involve some kind of moral judgment about, right and wrong, fair and unfair, what's good and what's bad.
Exactly. And that leads to some really fundamental questions, like what values are baked into our economic theories and models? Are we aware of them? Or are they hidden? And do they match up with, our broader ethical commitments?
It's like asking, what kind of world is this economic theory trying to create? And do we actually want to live in that world?
That's a great way to put it. Take, for example, the concept of economic efficiency, which we talked about before. Some economic theories are all about maximizing efficiency. They say the best economic system is the one that creates the most wealth or productivity, even if it causes inequality or other problems.
But like we discussed earlier, that makes you think about how that wealth is shared. Who benefits from this super efficient system? And what are we sacrificing for it? Are we giving up fairness or social harmony?
You're right, that's a key point. There's often a tension between efficiency and equity. It's this classic dilemma in economics, and there's no easy solution. Some people argue that we can have both, that a more efficient economy will also be fairer and more just. But others think that focusing too much on efficiency actually makes inequality worse. And they believe that ethical considerations need to be built right into our economic models and policies.
So it sounds like we can't just assume that a super efficient economy will automatically make the world a better place for everyone. We have to be more critical and ask ourselves, efficient for who? And what's the cost?
Absolutely. And this is where different ethical philosophies come in. For instance, utilitarians might argue that we should aim for economic systems that maximize overall happiness or well-being, even if it means some inequality is inevitable.
So it's like finding the solution that creates the most good for the most people, even if it means some individuals might end up worse off.
Yeah, that's the basic idea of utilitarianism. But other ethical frameworks might focus on different values, like fairness, justice, or individual rights. For example, a Rawlsian approach might stress making sure that the least advantaged members of society are protected and have real chances to get ahead.
So we're not just talking about abstract economic outcomes. We're talking about how those outcomes actually impact people's lives and how our moral principles should guide us in designing our economic systems.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point where moral philosophy and economics intersect. The issue of market failures.
Market failures, what are those?
They happen when the free market, if left alone, doesn't lead to an efficient or socially desirable outcome. Think about things like pollution, public goods, or monopolies. These are classic examples.
Right, so these are situations where the invisible hand of the market, as they say, kind of drops the ball, and it ends up hurting society as a whole.
Exactly. And here's where ethics become crucial. Should governments step in to fix these market failures? And if they do, how should they do it? What principles should guide their actions?
It seems like we're always trying to balance individual freedom with our collective responsibility. We want to let markets do their thing and let people make their own choices. But we also know that sometimes free markets lead to results that are harmful, unfair, or even unsustainable.
It's a tough balancing act, for sure. And there's no simple solution that fits every situation. Different philosophical perspectives offer different ways of thinking about these trade-offs and how to make ethical decisions in economic policy.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Efficiency, equity, market failures. It's clear that ethics is a big part of how we think about and design our economic systems. But I want to go back to something that's been in the back of my mind this whole time. If economics is so tied up with ethical questions, can it ever really be an objective science?
That's a really deep question, and it gets to the core of what philosophers of economics have been wrestling with for a long time. Can economics ever be as objective or value-free as, say, physics or chemistry?
Right, because in the natural sciences, we often think of truth as something that's out there, independent of what we believe or value. We observe, collect data, test ideas, and hopefully we reach conclusions that are objective and true for everyone, everywhere.
That's the ideal, yeah. But in economics, as we've been discussing, our values are mixed up with the questions we ask, the methods we use, and how we interpret the results.
So does that mean that economic truth is more subjective, more context-dependent, maybe even influenced by the economist's own political or ideological views?
It's definitely something to consider. Some philosophers of economics argue that while we should aim for objectivity, it's impossible to completely separate economic analysis from our values.
So maybe it's not about finding one single objective truth about the economy. Maybe it's more about recognizing that there are many different perspectives, that the issues are complex, and that we need to keep having these conversations and debates.
You've got it. And that's why the philosophy of economics is so valuable. It encourages us to think critically about the assumptions, values, and methods behind economic theories and policies. It reminds us that economics isn't just about cold, hard facts, but about human choices, human values, and the kind of world we want to build.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into the philosophy of economics. I don't know about you, but I found this incredibly stimulating and thought-provoking. It's amazing how many layers there are to this field and how many philosophical questions are hiding just beneath the surface of what seem like simple economic ideas.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and I hope you'll all continue to think about the philosophical puzzles behind economics.
Absolutely. Remember, economics isn't just about numbers and charts. It's about human choices, values, and the kind of world we want to create. So keep questioning, keep challenging assumptions, and keep exploring the fascinating connections between economics and philosophy. Until next time, happy deep diving.